Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In 1980s Southern California, 32-year-old single mother Dorothy Jane Scott was living a quiet life with her young son and parents when she began receiving disturbing phone calls from an unknown man, sometimes professing his love, sometimes threatening to cut her into pieces. This stalker knew her daily movements with terrifying precision. On May 28, 1980, after taking a coworker to the hospital for a spider bite, Dorothy vanished from the parking lot. Her car was seen speeding away with blinding headlights, but Dorothy was never seen alive again. For 4 years, her family received tormenting calls from a man claiming to have her, until Dorothy's charred remains were finally discovered in 1984. The stalker was never identified, the calls stopped, and decades later, this haunting case of obsession remains unsolved. Today, we dive into the disturbing disappearance of Dorothy Jane Scott. The disappearance of Dorothy Jane Scott is not a case that made national headlines, but it's one that has haunted Southern California for decades. It's a case that reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous threats can come from those we never even notice. It was May 28, 1980, in Anaheim, California. The weather was mild, typical for late spring in Orange County. Dorothy Jane Scott, a 32-year-old single mother, was attending an employee meeting at the joint offices of Swingers Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop in Anaheim, where she worked as a secretary. Dorothy was known as a responsible, devoted mother to her 4-year-old son, Shanti. She lived with her aunt and her parents in Stanton, California, and was described by those who knew her as kind-hearted and deeply religious. That evening, Dorothy noticed that her co-worker, Conrad Bostron, didn't look well. His arm was red and swollen from what appeared to be a spider bite. Dorothy, being the caring person she was, convinced Conrad to go to the emergency room at UC Irvine Medical Center. Another co-worker, Pam Head, decided to accompany them. While at the hospital, Dorothy remained attentive to Conrad's needs. She even went to fetch coffee for her colleagues as they waited for Conrad to be treated. According to Pam, Dorothy left them at around 11 p.m. to bring her car from the parking lot to the front entrance of the hospital. She said she was feeling cold and wanted to get a sweater from her car. Pam and Conrad waited at the hospital entrance, but Dorothy never returned. Instead, they witnessed something strange. They saw Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon speeding toward them with the headlights on full beam, making it impossible to see who was driving. But instead of stopping, the car suddenly swerved and sped away out of the parking lot. Confused and concerned, Pam and Conrad waited a bit longer before calling a cab to take them home. By the time Dorothy's parents reported her missing to the Anaheim Police Department the next morning, they had no idea of the horror that had been unfolding in their daughter's life for months before her disappearance. You see, Dorothy had been receiving anonymous phone calls at work for months. The male caller would sometimes profess his love for her, and other times he would make terrifying threats. He would describe what she was wearing on a particular day, or mention where she had been, proving he was watching her closely. According to Dorothy's mother, Vera, the caller once told Dorothy, "When I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits, so no one will ever find you." The calls terrified Dorothy. She started taking karate lessons for self-defense and was considering buying a handgun. She even mentioned to her parents that she feared she might be killed. But she never reported these calls to the police, perhaps out of fear or the belief that nothing could be done. She did, however, confide in her friends and family about the harassment. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that the stalker didn't stop after Dorothy disappeared. About a week after her disappearance, Dorothy's mother received a call from a man who said, "I've got her," and then hung up. The Scott family began to receive regular calls from this anonymous man, sometimes several times a day, sometimes once a week. These calls continued for 4 years. The Orange County Register, a local newspaper, also received calls from someone claiming to be Dorothy's killer. In one call, the man told an editor, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The case took an even more tragic turn on August 6, 1984, when construction workers found charred human remains, including a skull and some arm and leg bones, scattered near Santa Ana Canyon Road, about 10 miles from Anaheim. Dental records confirmed that these remains belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. The cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains. Interestingly, just a week before the discovery of Dorothy's remains, her mother had received another call from the anonymous man. This time he asked, "Is Dorothy home?" When Vera Scott said her daughter was dead, the man laughed and replied, "I know." This was the last call the family received from the stalker. The discovery of Dorothy's remains raised more questions than it answered. How did she die? Who was the stalker? Was he responsible for her death? And perhaps most hauntingly, why Dorothy? One theory that investigators considered was that the stalker might have been someone Dorothy knew, possibly someone she had encountered in her daily routine. Given the personal nature of the calls and the stalker's knowledge of her movements, it seemed likely that he was someone who had regular access to observe her. Another puzzling aspect of the case was the state of Dorothy's car when it was found. On June 12, 1980, about 2 weeks after her disappearance, Dorothy's Toyota was discovered burning in an alley about 10 miles from the UC Irvine Medical Center. The car had been set on fire, destroying any potential evidence inside. This deliberate act suggested that the perpetrator was trying to cover their tracks, further complicating the investigation. The timeline of events on the night of Dorothy's disappearance also raised questions. According to Pam Head and Conrad Bostron, Dorothy had left them at the hospital entrance to get her car at around 11 p.m. They then saw her car speeding toward them before swerving away. This suggests that Dorothy might have been abducted in the parking lot, and the perpetrator then drove her car past the hospital entrance. But there's a discrepancy in the timeline. Hospital records show that Conrad was discharged at 11 p.m., which means Dorothy would have left to get her car after that time. However, a witness reported seeing a woman matching Dorothy's description running to her car in the parking lot at around 11:30 p.m. The witness said the woman appeared frightened, as if someone was chasing her. This sighting, if accurate, suggests that Dorothy might have encountered her stalker in the parking lot and was trying to escape. But if she was running to her car, how did the stalker end up driving it? Did he overpower her? Or was the witness mistaken about what they saw? The investigation into Dorothy's disappearance and death was hampered by several factors. First, there was a delay in reporting her missing. Her co-workers didn't immediately realize something was wrong when she didn't return with her car, and her parents only reported her missing the next morning. This delay meant that crucial early hours of the investigation were lost. Second, the anonymous calls, while providing some insight into the stalker's mindset, didn't offer concrete leads. The caller was careful never to stay on the line long enough to be traced. In the pre-digital age of 1980, tracking phone calls was much more difficult than it is today. Third, the discovery of Dorothy's remains 4 years after her disappearance, in a decomposed and partially burnt state, limited what forensic evidence could be gathered. The cause of death could not be determined, and any trace evidence that might have been on her body was long gone. Despite these challenges, investigators continued to work on the case. They interviewed Dorothy's friends, family, and co-workers, trying to identify anyone who might have had an unhealthy interest in her. They looked into her past relationships and any potential conflict she might have had. but no clear suspects emerged. One person who was considered was an ex-boyfriend of Dorothy's, but he had a solid alibi for the night of her disappearance. Additionally, the anonymous calls continued even after this individual was questioned, suggesting he was not the stalker. Another avenue of investigation was Dorothy's work. As a secretary at two shops that catered to the counterculture of the time, she might have encountered individuals with unstable behavior. However, her co-workers reported that Dorothy was professional and didn't have any known conflicts with customers. The religious aspect of Dorothy's life was also examined. She was described as deeply religious, and some wondered if her stalker might have been someone she met through her church or religious activities. But again, no concrete leads were found. As the years passed, the case grew colder. The anonymous calls to Dorothy's family stopped after the discovery of her remains in 1984. The stalker, having perhaps achieved his goal or satisfied his twisted desires, faded into obscurity. But for Dorothy's family, especially her young son, the pain and questions remained. Shanti, who was only 4 when his mother disappeared, grew up without her. The trauma of losing a parent in such a violent and mysterious way is immeasurable, and the knowledge that the person responsible was never brought to justice adds another layer of pain. The case of Dorothy Jane Scott is a stark reminder of the vulnerability of individuals, especially women, to stalking and obsession. In 1980, stalking was not recognized as the serious crime it is today. There were fewer legal protections for victims and less awareness of the potential danger. Today, we understand that stalking often escalates to violence. We have laws specifically addressing stalking, and there are resources available for victims. But in 1980, Dorothy had limited options. She took self-defense classes and considered buying a gun, but she didn't have the legal and social support systems that might have protected her. The technology of the time also limited the investigation. Today, surveillance cameras, cell phone tracking, DNA analysis, and other advanced forensic techniques would provide investigators with tools they didn't have in 1980. A similar case today might have a different outcome, but for Dorothy Jane Scott, time has run out. Her case remains officially unsolved, one of the many cold cases that haunt law enforcement and the communities they serve. Her story, however, continues to be told, a cautionary tale about the dangers of stalking and the importance of taking threats seriously. In the decades since Dorothy's disappearance and death, there have been occasional reviews of her case. Cold case units, with fresh eyes and sometimes new technologies, have looked at the evidence. But without new leads or witnesses coming forward, progress has been limited. Some amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts have also taken an interest in Dorothy's case, combing through available information and sometimes developing their own theories. While these efforts haven't led to a resolution, they have helped keep Dorothy's story alive and her case in the public consciousness. One persistent theory is that Dorothy's stalker was someone she knew but didn't suspect. Given his knowledge of her movements and what she was wearing, he was clearly observing her regularly. This could have been someone she encountered in her daily routine, perhaps at work, at her son's school, at church, or in her neighborhood. Another theory is that the stalker was a customer at one of the shops where Dorothy worked. The nature of these establishments, a head shop and a psychic shop, might have attracted individuals with unstable behavior. Dorothy, as the secretary, would have been a visible and approachable figure. Some have also speculated about a potential connection to other crimes in the area. Southern California in the late 1970s and early 1980s saw several high-profile serial killers operating, including the freeway killer William Bonin and the night stalker Richard Ramirez. While there's no evidence linking Dorothy's case to these or other serial killers, the possibility can't be entirely ruled out. The method of Dorothy's abduction, if the witness account of her running to her car is accurate, suggests a level of planning and opportunity. The stalker would have had to know she was at the hospital that night, either by following her there or by chance. He would then have had to approach her in the parking lot in a way that frightened her enough to run, but still managed to overpower her and take control of her car. The subsequent burning of her car 2 weeks later also indicates a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence. This suggests that the perpetrator was aware of forensic techniques and was taking steps to cover his tracks. This level of caution and planning points to someone who was not acting on a sudden impulse, but had considered his actions. The anonymous calls to Dorothy's family and the newspaper add another layer to the case. The caller seemed to derive satisfaction from tormenting Dorothy's family and claiming responsibility for her death. This behavior is consistent with certain types of offenders who seek attention and control. The fact that the calls stopped after Dorothy's remains were discovered might indicate that the discovery brought a sense of closure or finality to the stalker. Alternatively, he might have feared that the discovery of her body would lead investigators closer to him, prompting him to cease all contact. Despite all these theories and speculations, the hard truth is that without new evidence or a confession, Dorothy's case may never be solved. The passage of time, the loss of potential witnesses, and the degradation of physical evidence all work against resolution. But the impact of Dorothy's case extends beyond the investigation itself. Her story has raised awareness about the dangers of stalking and the importance of taking threats seriously. It has highlighted the need for better legal protections for stalking victims and more effective law enforcement responses. For Dorothy's family, especially her son Shanti, the lack of closure remains a painful reality. Growing up without knowing who took his mother away or why is a burden no child should have to bear. And for Dorothy's parents, who received those tormenting calls for 4 years, the cruelty of the stalker extended far beyond the night of May 28, 1980. The case of Dorothy Jane Scott is a tragedy on multiple levels. A young mother's life was cut short. A child lost his mother. Parents lost their daughter. And a community lost its sense of security. The knowledge that someone capable of such cruelty was walking among them, perhaps continuing to observe and even interact with them, cast a long shadow. In the years since Dorothy's disappearance, countless other women have fallen victim to stalkers and obsessed individuals. Some have been more fortunate than Dorothy, escaping with their lives. Others have suffered similar fates. Each case is a reminder of the human capacity for obsession and the devastating consequences it can have. As we reflect on Dorothy's story, we are left with questions that may never be answered. Who was the man who called her at work, professing love one moment and threatening violence the next? What was his connection to her? What drove his obsession? And most hauntingly, is he still out there? For now, Dorothy Jane Scott remains one of the many faces of unsolved crimes, a reminder of the limits of justice and the enduring pain of unanswered questions. Her case file may be cold, but her story continues to resonate. A cautionary tale about the shadows that can lurk in even the most ordinary lives. The discovery of Dorothy Jane Scott's remains in 1984 brought a certain finality to her family's ordeal, but it did little to answer the burning questions surrounding her disappearance and death. The charred and scattered state of her remains made it impossible for forensic experts to determine how she died. Had she been strangled, stabbed, shot? These questions remained unanswered, adding to the family's anguish. What we do know about the night of May 28, 1980, paints a disturbing picture. The witness who reported seeing a woman matching Dorothy's description running frantically to her car in the hospital parking lot provides a crucial glimpse into her final moments. This woman appeared terrified, as if fleeing from someone. If this was indeed Dorothy, it suggests she was aware of the danger she was in. Perhaps she had spotted her stalker in the parking lot. Perhaps he had revealed himself to her. Whatever the case, her attempt to escape proved futile. The fact that her car was seen speeding away from the hospital entrance with the headlights on full beam, making it impossible for Pam Head and Conrad Bostron to identify the driver, suggests a deliberate tactic by the abductor. By blinding potential witnesses with the high beams, he ensured no one could get a good look at him or possibly see Dorothy if she was in the car. This level of forethought indicates planning rather than a crime of opportunity. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is the stalker's persistence both before and after Dorothy's disappearance. Jacob Bachman, an editor at the Orange County Register, received multiple calls from a man claiming to be Dorothy's killer. In one call in June 1980, shortly after her disappearance, the caller told Bachman, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." This call reveals something significant about the stalker's mindset. He viewed Dorothy as his love, suggesting a delusional belief in a relationship that didn't exist. His accusation that she was cheating further indicates his detachment from reality, as Dorothy wasn't in a relationship with him to begin with. This type of delusional thinking is often seen in cases of erotomania, a psychological condition where an individual believes another person, often of higher social status or a public figure, is in love with them despite evidence to the contrary. The calls to Dorothy's family were equally disturbing. According to Vera Scott, Dorothy's mother, the caller would sometimes just ask, "Is Dorothy there?" When told she wasn't, he would hang up. Other times, he would make more explicit statements, like the call a week after Dorothy's disappearance where he simply said, "I've got her," before hanging up. These calls continued for 4 years, tormenting the family and preventing them from finding any peace. The caller seemed to derive satisfaction from their pain, a common trait among certain types of offenders who seek power and control through causing suffering to others. The final call, just a week before Dorothy's remains were discovered, was perhaps the most chilling. When the caller asked if Dorothy was home and Vera Scott replied that her daughter was dead, his response, "I know," followed by laughter, reveals a disturbing lack of empathy and possibly even pleasure in the family's suffering. The timing of this final call, just before the discovery of Dorothy's remains, has led some investigators to speculate whether the caller might have been involved in the remains being found. Did he tip off authorities anonymously? Did he revisit the site where he had disposed of Dorothy's body, potentially drawing attention to it? Or was it merely a coincidence? These questions remain unanswered. The location where Dorothy's remains were found, near Santa Ana Canyon Road, is significant. This area, about 10 miles from Anaheim, is relatively remote, suggesting that the killer was familiar with the region and chose a spot where he was unlikely to be observed disposing of a body. This again points to planning rather than panic. The condition of Dorothy's remains, charred and scattered, indicates an attempt to destroy evidence and possibly delay identification. This is consistent with the burning of her car 2 weeks after her disappearance, further suggesting a methodical approach to covering tracks. Investigators at the time explored various angles. They looked into Dorothy's personal life, her relationships, her work, and her daily routines, trying to identify anyone who might have had an unhealthy interest in her. They interviewed her coworkers, friends, and family members, hoping to find a lead. One aspect they particularly focused on was the nature of the anonymous calls Dorothy had been receiving at work. According to her friends and family, these calls had been going on for months before her disappearance. The caller would sometimes describe what Dorothy was wearing that day, or mention places she had been, proving he was watching her closely. This level of surveillance suggests that the stalker was someone who had regular opportunities to observe Dorothy. He might have lived in her neighborhood, worked near her, frequented the same places, or had some other connection that allowed him to monitor her movements without arousing suspicion. The fact that the calls came to her workplace rather than her home is also noteworthy. It suggests that the stalker might have had a connection to her job or felt more comfortable contacting her there. Perhaps he was a customer at one of the shops where she worked, or maybe he worked or lived nearby. Dorothy's job at the joint offices of Swinger's Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop put her in contact with a wide range of individuals. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, head shops, which sold paraphernalia used for the consumption of cannabis and other recreational drugs, often attracted a diverse clientele. Similarly, a psychic shop would draw people seeking guidance or spiritual connection. Among these customers could have been individuals with unstable behavior or unhealthy fixations. As a secretary, Dorothy would have been a visible and approachable figure, potentially making her a target for someone with boundary issues or delusional thinking. Her kindness and helpfulness, qualities that led her to take Conrad Bostron to the hospital that fateful night, might have been misinterpreted by a disturbed individual as romantic interest. The religious aspect of Dorothy's life has also been considered. Described as deeply religious, she might have been involved in church activities or religious groups. While these communities are generally supportive and positive, they can sometimes include individuals with rigid or extreme views, particularly regarding women's roles or behavior. Could someone from her religious community have developed an unhealthy fixation on her? Another avenue of investigation was Dorothy's role as a single mother. She was devoted to her 4-year-old son, Shanti, and lived with her parents and aunt, partly to provide a stable home for him. The identity of Shanti's father and Dorothy's relationship with him have not been widely discussed in reports about the case. Could there have been conflict or resentment related to this relationship? The timing of Dorothy's disappearance, late at night after she had voluntarily gone to the hospital to help a coworker, suggests that the stalker either followed her there or knew her routine well enough to predict her movements. This level of knowledge again points to someone with regular access to observe her. The fact that Dorothy had been taking karate lessons for self-defense and was considering buying a handgun indicates how seriously she took the threats. She clearly feared for her safety. Yet, she didn't report the calls to the police. This reluctance might have stemmed from a belief that nothing could be done, a fear of escalating the situation, or perhaps even a suspicion about who the caller might be. In the early 1980s, stalking was not recognized as the serious crime it is today. Law enforcement agencies often had limited resources or training to deal with such cases, and victims were sometimes not taken seriously until a physical assault occurred. This societal and institutional context might have contributed to Dorothy's decision not to involve the authorities. The investigation into Dorothy's disappearance and death was hampered by several factors beyond the initial delay in reporting her missing. The burning of her car destroyed potential physical evidence, such as fingerprints, hair, fibers, or blood, that might have linked the perpetrator to the crime. Similarly, the condition of her remains when they were found 4 years later limited what forensic evidence could be gathered. The anonymous calls, while providing some insight into the stalker's mindset, didn't offer concrete leads. The caller was careful never to stay on the line long enough to be traced. In 1980, before the widespread use of caller ID, cell phones, and other modern telecommunications technologies, tracking phone calls required physical tracing equipment and the caller to remain on the line for a significant amount of time. Despite these challenges, investigators pursued every available lead. They looked into similar cases in the area, considering whether Dorothy might have been a victim of a serial offender. They reviewed her known associates and any potential conflicts. They examined the patterns of the anonymous calls, hoping to find a clue to the caller's identity. But as months turned into years with no significant breaks in the case, it gradually became colder. The discovery of Dorothy's remains in 1984, while providing some closure for her family, didn't substantially advance the investigation. And when the anonymous calls stopped after her remains were found, one of the few active leads in the case disappeared. In the decades since Dorothy's death, advances in forensic science and investigative techniques have revolutionized how cold cases are approached. DNA analysis, which wasn't available in 1980, has helped solve countless cold cases. Geographic profiling, psychological profiling, and other analytical methods have provided new tools for understanding and solving complex cases. However, the application of these modern techniques to Dorothy's case is limited by the evidence that was preserved. If biological evidence from the scene of her abduction or from her car was collected and properly stored, it might be possible to extract DNA profiles. But given the burning of her car and the condition of her remains, such evidence might not exist. The passage of time also complicates the investigation. Witnesses' memories fade, potential suspects may have died, and the physical landscape changes, making it difficult to reconstruct crime scenes or understand the context of events. Despite these challenges, cold case units and dedicated investigators continue to review unsolved cases like Dorothy's. Sometimes a fresh perspective or a new piece of information can break open a case that has been cold for decades. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in cold cases, fueled in part by true crime documentaries, podcasts, and online communities. This public attention can sometimes generate new leads or pressure authorities to allocate resources to old cases. For Dorothy's family, particularly her son Shanti, the lack of resolution continues to be a source of pain. Growing up without his mother, and with the knowledge that her killer was never brought to justice, has undoubtedly shaped his life in profound ways. Vera and Jacob Scott, Dorothy's parents, lived with the dual burden of losing their daughter and being tormented by her presumed killer for 4 years. The psychological impact of receiving calls from the person likely responsible for their daughter's death, hearing his voice and his taunts, is immeasurable. The case of Dorothy Jane Scott stands as a stark reminder of the devastating impact of stalking and obsession. It highlights the vulnerability of individuals, especially women, to this type of targeted harassment and the potential for such behavior to escalate to violence. In the years since Dorothy's death, awareness of stalking as a serious crime has increased. Legal protections for victims have been strengthened, and law enforcement agencies have developed better protocols for responding to stalking reports. Many jurisdictions now have specialized units or officers trained to handle stalking cases. Technology has also provided new tools for both stalkers and their victims. While modern surveillance technologies and social media can make it easier for stalkers to monitor their targets, they also create digital footprints that can be used as evidence. Similarly, security systems, location tracking, and emergency response apps offer potential protection for those being stalked. But despite these advances, stalking remains a serious and pervasive problem. Many victims, like Dorothy, still face the terrifying reality of being watched, followed, and threatened by individuals fixated on them. And tragically, some of these cases still end in violence. The case of Dorothy Jane Scott serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of taking stalking and threats seriously. It underscores the need for robust support systems for victims, effective law enforcement responses, and greater public awareness of the warning signs and dangers of stalking behavior. For those investigating cold cases like Dorothy's, the the passage of time presents both challenges and opportunities. While evidence may degrade and witnesses may become unavailable, new technologies and methodologies can sometimes shed light on long unsolved crimes. Additionally, relationships and loyalties change over time, occasionally leading individuals with knowledge of a crime to come forward years or decades later. In recent years, genetic genealogy has emerged as a powerful tool for solving cold cases. By comparing DNA evidence from crime scenes to genetic profiles in public databases, investigators have identified suspects in cases that had been cold for decades. While this technique might not be applicable to Dorothy's case due to the limited physical evidence, it represents the kind of innovative approach that can bring resolution to seemingly unsolvable crimes. Another modern investigative tool is the digitization and analysis of old case files and evidence. By applying advanced analytics to case information, investigators can sometimes identify patterns or connections that weren't apparent during the original investigation. This approach doesn't require new physical evidence and can be applied to cases where traditional forensic methods are limited. The psychological aspects of Dorothy's case also warrant consideration. The behavior of her stalker, his persistent calls, his surveillance, his apparent delusions about a relationship with her, and his continued tormenting of her family after her disappearance, provides insights into his mindset and motivations. The stalker's fixation on Dorothy likely began well before the anonymous calls started. He might have observed her for some time, building a fantasy relationship in his mind before making contact. His calls, alternating between professions of love and violent threats, suggest emotional instability and possibly a personality disorder. His claim that Dorothy was cheating on him indicates a delusional belief in a relationship that didn't exist. This type of thinking is characteristic of erotomania, a delusional disorder where an individual believes another person is in love with them, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Erotomanic delusions can sometimes lead to stalking behavior as the individual attempts to establish or maintain the imagined relationship. The stalker's continued calls to Dorothy's family and the newspaper after her disappearance suggest a need for attention and possibly a desire to maintain a connection to her, even in death. His apparent pleasure in tormenting her family indicates sadistic tendencies and a lack of empathy. These psychological insights, while not identifying the stalker, provide a profile that might help narrow down potential suspects. They suggest someone with a history of obsessive behavior, difficulty maintaining healthy relationships, and possibly previous instances of stalking or harassment. The geographic aspects of the case also offer potential clues. The locations of Dorothy's abduction, the UC Irvine Medical Center parking lot, where her car was found burning, an alley about 10 miles from the hospital, and where her remains were discovered, near Santa Ana Canyon Road, create a triangle of activity that might correspond to areas the perpetrator was familiar with or felt comfortable operating in. This geographic pattern might align with where the stalker lived, worked, or regularly traveled. It suggests someone with knowledge of Orange County and possibly a connection to Anaheim, Stanton, where Dorothy lived, or the areas in between. The timing of events is another aspect worth considering. The stalker's ability to abduct Dorothy from the hospital parking lot suggests he either followed her there or knew she would be there. If he followed her, he would have had to be monitoring her movements that evening. If he knew she would be at the hospital, he might have had inside information about her plans or routine. The burning of her car 2 weeks after her disappearance and the discovery of her remains 4 years later also create a timeline that might correspond to the stalker's activities or movements. Did he wait 2 weeks to burn the car because he was hiding it somewhere? Did he dispose of Dorothy's body immediately after her abduction, or did he keep her somewhere for a period of time? These questions, while disturbing to contemplate, are the kind that investigators must consider when trying to understand what happened to Dorothy and who was responsible. For Dorothy's family and friends, the lack of answers continues to be a source of pain. Not knowing exactly what happened to her or who was responsible leaves a wound that can never fully heal. The knowledge that her killer might still be out there, perhaps having gone on to harm others, adds another layer of anguish. For the wider community, Dorothy's case serves as a reminder of the human capacity for obsession and cruelty. It highlights the vulnerability we all face to random or targeted violence and the limits of our ability to protect ourselves and those we love. But Dorothy's story also underscores the importance of community vigilance and support for those experiencing stalking or harassment. By taking threats seriously, supporting victims, and working with law enforcement, communities can help prevent similar tragedies. As time passes, the chances of resolving Dorothy's case may diminish, but the impact of her story remains powerful. It continues to raise awareness about stalking, to remind us of the importance of personal safety, and to highlight the enduring human desire for justice and answers. Dorothy Jane Scott was more than a victim. She was a devoted mother, a caring daughter, a helpful colleague, and a woman of faith. Her life, cut short by violence, leaves a legacy that extends beyond her tragic end. In remembering her story, we honor her memory and reaffirm our commitment to seeking justice for all victims of violence, no matter how much time has passed. The case of Dorothy Jane Scott remains officially unsolved. Her stalker and presumed killer has never been identified or brought to justice, but her story continues to be told, ensuring that she is not forgotten and that the search for answers, however elusive they may be, goes on.